to. Oftentimes, without our even knowing it, history lies at our feet just waiting to be picked up to share its stories with us. Today, April 2nd, 2017, my friend Gil and I went hunting for Indian artifacts in an old farm field not far from where the junction of the Shiawassee and Tittabawassee rivers is at. Its location has made the area very important for well over 4,000 years, as the Native American Indians used the waterways of Michigan as their highways. Naturally, the confluence of two great rivers saw a tremendous amount of human activity. However, today I want to tell you of some finds that Gil and I made that speak of more recent history. Well, sort of. In particular, the 1830s. We began finding shards of white glazed pottery, and I began gathering them up. Gil mentioned to me, and he said, this is the spot where Albert Miller settled in 1833. In fact, he said, you remember me selling you some musket balls that I found here, to which I nodded yes. And he continued, well, his log cabin was right here. The white fragments of glazed ceramics, as well as salt glazed ware that I was finding, were definitely of that era. Here was a site of one of Saginaw, Michigan's earliest residents, when Michigan was not even a state, but was part of the very large Michigan territory. Actually, it even extended out as far as the Dakotas. There were not a lot of white residents at the time, and as difficult as it is to envision today, the whites were far, far outnumbered by the Native Americans, whose domed, bark-covered homes dotted the landscape. Mr. Miller and other early settlers must have been very brave to settle in a wilderness where they were so outnumbered, and yes, Saginaw was indeed a wilderness, and a swampy one at that. There at our feet, and filling up my pockets quickly, was all that remained of Albert Miller's homestead as far as laying on the surface of the ground. Let's take a look together at who this brave pioneer was, because his story and the hardships that he endured and still became a success are quite interesting. Mr. Miller was born in Hartland, Windsor County, Vermont on May 10, 1810. His father, Jeremy Miller, was of English descent and was a native of Middletown, Connecticut. Mr. Miller's mother was named Mary, and she was a native of Hartland also, and her maternal grandfather, having been the first settler of that town, and her ancestors on her father's side were among those who arrived at Plymouth Rock in 1620. Albert's father, Jeremy, passed away in March of 1817, leaving Albert to care for his very devoted mother. Albert was a man of strong character, which developed in him when he was very young. Until he was 9 years old, Albert attended the district school in a big native town for 3 summers out of each year. And from the time he was 18, he attended 6 months a year. Now, by this age, his education was such that he was able to teach a district school himself and occupied himself with that work over the course of 2 winters. In 1830, Albert Miller entered the Kimball and Union Academy at Meridian, New Hampshire. It was his determination to get as thorough of an education as was possible. He was, however, delivered a life-altering blow within a mere 4 weeks of entering that academy. He was stricken with a severe illness, and what it was I have not found on record, but it so weakened him that he was forced to give up his goal of a college education. Upon somewhat recovering his health, Albert decided to move west. He left his home on the 2nd of September, 1830, and arrived out west, if you will, at Detroit, Michigan on September 22nd, because truly, that was out west in those times. The people of Detroit were proud of their city and boasted of its being home to 2,222 people. Albert was joined by his father's family in the spring of 1831, and he located and settled on an 80-acre tract of Grand Blanc in Genesee County. In 1833, Albert purchased from the government a tract of land on the east side of the Saginaw River at the junction of the Shiawassee and Tittabawassee rivers, which, by the way, was right where Gil and I were picking up the shards of pottery. He settled there in February of 1833. In the spring of 1833, elections were held, and Albert was elected to an office which constituted him one of the inspectors of elections for his township, and while residing on this site for 15 years, he was a constant member of the Board of Inspectors and was never absent from a single election. The county of Saginaw was fully organized in 1835, still a full 2 years before Michigan was to become a state. Albert Miller was appointed judge of probate for the county by Stevens T. Mason, who was at the time acting governor of the Michigan Territory. And Mr. Miller held that position for 9 years. He also served as justice of the peace for the township of Saginaw for 13 successive years. In 1847, Mr. Miller represented the county of Saginaw in the state Republican Party, having always been opposed to the aggressive power of the slaveholders and to the extension of the institution of slavery. Judge Albert Miller died at his home in Bay City on September 19, 1893. The Michigan Pioneer and Historical Society, at their annual meeting of June 6th and 7th, 1894, presented a document titled Memoir of Judge Albert Miller, and I'd like to read you some select excerpts from that document. Forgive me if there is some minor duplication in information. As mentioned earlier, Albert's father was Jeremy Miller, who, with his own father, Jonathan, came to Heartland in 1795, where, in 1802, he was married to Sarah Hodgman, a native of Heartland, daughter of Major Lot Hodgman, who was a soldier of the Revolution and afterward a major of the militia. So it is clear Albert came from very noble stock. This document goes into much greater detail, though, about his arrival and sometimes harrowing adventures here in Michigan. As already stated, he arrived at Detroit on I think it was September 23rd of 1830, and then proceeded northward to Grand Blanc and the Flint River. In fact, he wintered on the Flint River in 1830 and 1831. But two families occupied the site of what is now the city of Flint. Albert's mother and two sisters followed him in June of 1831, and together they settled on 80 acres of land in Grand Blanc, and that he located and purchased from the government. And in the winter of 1831-32, Albert taught school in Grand Blanc, it being the second term of school taught in the lower peninsula of Michigan, north of Waterford. In November 1831, business called him to Saginaw, and the large river of fertile soil were so attractive to him that he determined to have a home on the banks of the Saginaw River and purchased land there. However, in 1836, he sold that farm and purchased 256 acres, on which, in July of that year, he laid out the village of Portsmouth, Michigan, now a part of Bay City, which was the fast move made towards building a town in that vicinity. What was afterward called Lower Saginaw and Bay City proper at the time was an Indian reservation. Now here's an episode in his life that illustrates life in those rugged early days of the Michigan frontier could indeed be extremely rough. Mr. Miller was determined to build a steam sawmill on the Portsmouth track, and he went to Ohio to purchase the machinery, and this was shipped to Detroit, where after hunting for 2 weeks for a vessel to charter, he found one. But the price of the charter to Portsmouth was quite extreme, and he had to furnish his own crew. The total cost would have been 1/3 the value of the vessel itself. So Mr. Miller, to solve the problem, bought the vessel and manned it. Loading his mill machinery and $4,000 worth of merchandise, he saw his vessel sail from Detroit with a fair wind on the 22nd of November, while he himself started overland to Saginaw by pony. Cold weather had set in, and the roads were almost impassable, so that when he reached Flint, he was told he might as well leave his pony there as to leave it in the woods, for it was impossible for a horse to get to Saginaw. Now, being worn with fatigue and illness, he was unable to get to Saginaw himself, and so purchased a canoe and started down the Flint River to reach his destination. But there were still hurdles ahead for him that would be major blocks to his path and his plans. 25 miles down the river in his canoe, Mr. Miller found the river blocked with ice. He hauled the canoe ashore and followed the bank, but soon encountered a bayou where he had to wade in water breast deep, breaking the ice with his arms. And remember, he was an ill man at the time that he did this. After many problems, he reached Portsmouth only to find the mouth of the river closed with ice and his vessel being nowhere in sight. After waiting in suspense 2 or 3 weeks, he learned that the unfaithful captain that he had employed had laid up the vessel at Port Huron and was living on board with his family. On receiving this news, Mr. Miller started on foot to go to Port Huron by way of Detroit, but on reaching Saginaw, his worn body would no longer obey his will, and he was thrown upon a bed of sickness, where he remained 3 weeks before being able to pursue his journey to Detroit, where he found that a friend had discharged the captain and paid off the crew, and thus stopped some of the heavy expenses at Port Huron. But his plan was to build a steam sawmill at Portsmouth, and every pound of iron and machinery for the mill, and all the goods were hauled on sleighs to Portsmouth, where the mill was put in operation in April of 1837. The financial crash and wildcat times were then on. Nothing possessed solidarity. The paper currency became worthless, and Saginaw was isolated from the rest of the world by 40 miles of wilderness, and although he attempted a mercantile business, circumstances were such that he found it a policy to abandon, and so, exchanging the 40 acres land of wild land, which is now part of East Saginaw at the time this was written, for a tract on the Tittabawassee River, and he went to farming, which he continued in 1839 to 1847, when he began again to commence the lumber business at the old Portsmouth Mill, which, however, he abandoned in 1852, and from that time until 1874, he was employed in his time in clearing and cultivating and selling property in Portsmouth. From 1878 to 1883, he engaged in reclaiming a large tract of marshland, the embankment around which, however, was destroyed by an unusual rise of water. And besides this, he was instrumental in organizing and was a stockholder and director in the first salt company that made salt in Bay City. He was a stockholder and director in the company organized to build the first railroad to Bay City. He caused the building of the first sawmill on the lower part of the Saginaw River, and he was the first postmaster at Portsmouth, having received the appointment in 1837 from Amos Kendall, Postmaster General, under President Jackson. He was supervisor of the town of Saginaw in 1848, of Hampton in 1854, and of Portsmouth in 1860, and was president of the village of Portsmouth in 1869 and 70, and would have been the mayor of Bay City in 1873 if there had not been too many Democratic votes cast against him. In 1875, he was appointed by Governor Bagley agent of the State Board of Corrections and Charities for Bay County, which he held until his death. He has been a member of various temperance societies, and was instrumental in organizing the Pioneer and Historical Society of Michigan in 1874, of which he was the first president. The society has published 22 volumes of its collections, many articles being Mr. Miller's contributions. He united with the First Presbyterian Church of Saginaw in February 1839, and has been an elder in that church at Bay City for over 30 years. He was a delegate to the General Assembly of the Presbyterian Church at Philadelphia in 1863, and to the General Assembly of the Presbyterian Church at Philadelphia in 1870, and of Brooklyn in 1876. And yes, if you notice, I repeated something there accidentally. Sorry. In politics, he was a Democrat until the formation of the Republican Party, which, again, as I said, had always been opposed to the aggressive power of the slaveholders and to the extension of the institution of slavery. And that's a brief account of Judge Albert Miller's life and his adventures in the wilds of Michigan, trying to settle Portsmouth Township, and his life on the farm there at the confluence of the Shiawassee and Tittabawassee rivers, all of which came to my attention by a few simple shards of broken ceramics that were found by Gil Albury and myself where his homestead had been located. And you've been seeing as we go along pictures of those fragments, very unassuming looking, very unimportant looking, but historically quite significant. Well, I hope you've enjoyed this program, and that if you did, you will give me a thumbs up and subscribe so you don't miss out on another single program here on my favorite channel, the Dennis Morrison channel. God bless all of you, and have a great day.